to a Hope 1032 podcast.
Hello everyone, it's so good to be back with you. Welcome to Season 6 of Raising Teens. I'm your host, Collett Smart. I'm a psychologist, a teacher, and also a parent in the middle of raising my own teen and young adult children. I started this podcast because I know that many teens are struggling, and I wanted to create an online village of support for parents. I'm joined again this season by well-known experts on teen mental health and well-being. I have such hope for this generation of young people, so each episode is jam-packed with support so that you can get on with the job that you do best. That is, connecting with and loving your teen. Dr Maddi Derrick is a clinical psychologist and founding director of Hobart ADHD Consultants, where she leads a team of psychologists providing neurodivergent affirming assessment and treatment services for ADHD. She has lived experience of ADHD herself and is a passionate advocate for a better deal for the ADHD community. She was involved in the development of the Australian evidence-based clinical guidelines for ADHD and is a regular contributor to the media related to ADHD. Hello, Maddi. Welcome to Raising Teens.
Thanks, Collett. It's great to be here.
So, Maddi, I mentioned to you before recording that I have both immediate and extended family members with a diagnosis of ADHD, so both adults and young people. I don't talk in a lot of detail because that is their story to tell, but this is a topic I'm really passionate about, and it's something I think I was researching when I first began as a teacher more than 2 decades ago, and then obviously in my own work as a school counsellor and a private practitioner. We know even more now about ADHD than we did 20 years ago, 10 years ago, but there's still so many myths about ADHD that come up, I think, almost every week in the media. So can you tell us a little bit about some of the common ones that you hear and why they are myths?
Absolutely. There's been so much work in the advocacy space over the last 10 years to try and get past all the misinformation out there. And we've come a long way. Things are definitely improving. I think some standout ones at the moment are this issue around whether we're overdiagnosing ADHD.
Yes.
And people, because they're hearing about it more, it's appearing in the media more, and then it appears in the media more, and then so they hear about it more, and it sort of creates this picture that suddenly we're diagnosing every second kid with ADHD and putting them on medication, which of course is absolutely not what's happening. And part of the problem is that often the media are reporting on statistics that come out of the United States, and they possibly are starting to verge on overdiagnosis and need to have a look at that. But in Australia, we're definitely underdiagnosing and undertreating ADHD, and we have really, really firm statistics on that. We know that the prevalence rate in the population will be around 5%, and there's only about 1 in 10 of those 5% the adults that are on ADHD medication, and 1 in 3 children. That's where we're at currently, and those are rates that have doubled from 10 years ago. So it's understandable people think it's increasing, but we're just really playing catch up and diagnosing people that we missed before, and we're misdiagnosing them with other conditions.
Yeah, and we often see familial patterns or genetic patterns. So often I've heard parents say, when my son or my daughter got a diagnosis, I looked at them and I went, oh my goodness, that was me as a child. And that is why we're seeing adults being diagnosed, because they're suddenly recognizing what was missed for them. And I suppose some of the pain they went through because they didn't have the support that they could have had years ago. I mean, we didn't know as much then, but there are things that were missed. One of the other myths I can't stand is that it's not really ADHD, we just need more firm parenting. That child just needs some more discipline.
Yes, yeah, that's a big one. And the older generation particularly can get a bit stuck with that and think it's due to the evils of modern society and screens and too much sugar and parents pandering to their kids and all that sort of stuff. The thing is, ADHD has always been around.
We can sometimes hear people say, when I was at school, no one had ADHD, and maybe kids today just need more discipline. But when you look back, you will know there were other behaviors that showed up. These kids were often given other labels. The dropout, the rebellious kid, the misfit, the naughty one, or perhaps they were the geek, the dork, the nervous one. And then I wonder what might be happening for some of them now that they are adults. As you've heard me say in previous episodes, it can be common for a parent to suddenly recognize themselves when their child gets a diagnosis. I know many adults who only got a diagnosis of ADHD in their 30s or 40s, but had been feeling the symptoms their entire lives.
The ADHD type of brain has always been around. There's only been 2 times in history where the natural prevalence rates that we know of would have increased. And one was when they brought in humidity cribs, so little babies that might not have survived before did, and then along with whatever other issues, if they were born premature, ADHD would have been in the mix, but also as women started going into the workforce more and having children later, we might have had a slight increase there due to genetic changes as you get a bit older. So the bad parenting stigma has been around for a long time with ADHD, and I think it's for parents who are parenting a child who is neurodivergent, they're working so much harder than the average parent by far, and it can be a real slap in the face to hear this myth. So I'm glad that it's often being raised and dispelled. Compared to earlier days, previous generations particularly like to ask about the bad parenting aspect. And I think in those days, discipline could be more harsh for children. And so for children that were seen to, not be meeting expectations and doing as they were asked, like children with ADHD, they might have been scared into submission. And it might have looked on the surface like they were doing what was required. They would have been doing a lot of masking in that sense, and then that would be coming at a huge cost, and we'd have a lot of maladaptive coping mechanisms get into place in those sort of situations. So hopefully without that harsh discipline these days, we're actually creating healthier kids for the longer term, and that's neurotypical children as well for all kids. So, the other aspect to that is if you think about someone observing a parent of a child with ADHD, it can be easy to misunderstand what's happening. And perhaps if the ADHD isn't diagnosed, the parent isn't aware, perhaps they're in that cycle that many parents get into where you get desperate and you start getting more and more harsh in your discipline to try and turn this kid around. What's going on to them? How harsh do we need to get for them to learn? And so it would be easy to observe that and then assume that the harsh parenting is causing the child's behaviour rather than seeing it as the cause being the other way. But then on the flip side, if we do have a child that's been diagnosed and the parent understands ADHD and knows what they're doing, it would be easy to watch and think that they're perhaps being too soft and they're allowing their child to get away with things and creating the difficulties. So I think we need a lot of awareness and education, but perhaps the golden rule is if you haven't experienced it, don't judge it. It'd be nice if we all went with that.
Yeah, stay away from the parent blame.
Yes.
Absolutely. I've seen parents with 3-4 children, and they may only have 1 or 2 of their children with a diagnosis of ADHD or they're neurodiverse children, and they parent similarly or the same, and yet their children respond differently because of their differences. And honestly, those parents need compassion because there are differences in the way you might approach something with your children. Personalities is one thing, but then if your child has a diagnosis, that you do things differently because it's important. It's important for that child. It's important for your own relationship with your child. And then you mentioned the sugar. Oh, goodness. I remember the years, even as a teacher, where some parents years ago were really anti any form of intervention, and they just took their child off every form of sugar. And these poor little children were sitting in the classroom. Everyone's having parties, and the parents were hoping this would be the cure, but their child couldn't have the cupcakes and it wasn't curing their child. There isn't a cure. You mentioned briefly there about the brain. Could you expand on that a little bit about the difference? Because that's something that's irrefutable, that there's actually a difference in the brain of a person who has an ADHD diagnosis.
Yes, neuroimaging technology advances have been really, really great for the ADHD space, because we had a really significant study that involved 17 countries, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of participants having their brains scanned and compared to each other. And that, I think the study came out, it was around about 2017, and being such a big study of such good quality, it was finally taken seriously, these structural and neurochemical differences that we do see in the ADHD brain. So it's not that you can put someone in an MRI machine and say whether they've got ADHD or not, but with those large numbers and measuring various sizes, various areas of the brain, the density, and looking at the activity levels there, and looking at the averages, we can see differences between people with ADHD and people without ADHD. So we know there's those structural and chemical differences there. In terms of the functioning, the differences, we have the name attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which really doesn't actually explain those well at all. It's not an attention deficit per se, it's actually a difficulty with regulating your attention and controlling where it goes. So compared to most people, compared to the neurotypical person, someone with ADHD will struggle to stay focused on something that's very important but not overly interesting to them, compared to something that really captures their interest, their personal interest levels, or something that's new and novel. So we can either be really distracted, have trouble staying focused, or we can be completely hyper-focused and have trouble shifting away from something. So there's the attention regulation aspect, which is very much core to ADHD. Some people will have hyperactivity, particularly if they're younger, but a lot won't. And most will have some level of impulsivity. And it might not be something you see. It might just be an impulsivity in your own thoughts and having very fast-moving thought processes or emotional reactivity. Just subtle little fidgeting might come about there. The things that don't get a look in at all in our diagnostic criteria are emotion regulation, which is an enormous issue for many people with ADHD. It's not in the diagnostic criteria because it doesn't help health professionals pick apart ADHD from anxiety or depression or other conditions. And sort of newer thing that is being recognised is this difference in time perception, time blindness, having trouble feeling time pass, knowing how long something has been taking, how long something will take, having an ability to be able to sort of project yourself forward to a future point and make decisions there in the same way that you would if something was happening right now. And motivation is a huge one. So when we're not talking here motivation as in what you want to do, we're talking about what your brain will actually activate and act on. So it's at any moment, our brains could be turning their resources to anything around us in our environment or our sort of internal processes. And what it chooses to respond to is sort of this, what it's motivated to, what it's drawn to. And with ADHD particularly, very heavily reliant on activation of the reward pathways in the brain to get that activation of the brain going. So it doesn't matter how important you know it is to do your tax return. If your brain is not getting any activation in those reward pathways, it might really, really struggle to just start putting resources into that task of the tax return. So that's what we know in terms of functionality is going on with the ADHD brain. And then, of course, the subjective experience of it is a whole nother thing, because then it's not that you feel like, oh, gee, I'm not perceiving time well. It's more that you have a sense of, how is that possible? I thought that'd been like 2 minutes. How did that time pass? And this sort of state of confusion and overwhelm that starts to happen, and then starting to feel get hypervigilant to what's going on, worried about making errors, but also feeling very exhausted and burnt out. There's a lot more to this subjective experience I could talk about, of course.
Yes. So I just want to come back to something there. You mentioned the term maladaptive. Can you just expand on that a little bit for our listeners? You said sometimes in the past where there was parenting that might have been quite punitive and they were scared into submission. Later on, they displayed maladaptive behaviors. What would that look like?
Yeah, learned helplessness, people pleasing. These are the sort of secondary outcomes that commonly come up for people with ADHD. So learned helplessness is where someone has fallen into a habit where they don't try and stand up for themselves or solve problems or try new things, because their experience is that nothing they do will work. So they've learned, why bother? And then the people pleasing is I just need to do everything I can to keep this person happy with me, because there's definitely going to be a moment coming up at any time soon where they're not going to be happy with me. So I need to curry favour as much as possible so as to not upset people. So these ones are common. There's a whole suite of these patterns of responding, I suppose, that are based really on a fight-flight response. Got our being reactive, defensive, that's our fight response, the flight, the avoidance, that learned helplessness, submitting, the people-pleasing, and attaching, trying to bond with people and please them, but also the deflecting.
You heard us use the term maladaptive behaviors. These are generally those behaviors that negatively impact our relationships and also our overall well-being. They're a form of coping with difficult situations and protecting us from judgment or shame. Things like white lies or people-pleasing may not seem as dangerous as smoking weed or binge drinking, but the problem with maladaptive behaviors is that they are motivated by fears or insecurities, and they often reinforce the thing you're trying to avoid in the first place. So we need to help our teens to find healthy ways of coping with stress, anxiety, or fear.
We can see with adults, particularly these cover-up habits, and it's a deflection, which is part of the fight-flight system, to deflect a threat away elsewhere. And it might be something as simple as saying to your partner that, no, you didn't get the milk on the way home because the traffic was too bad, when in actual fact you've just forgotten. Yeah. White lie to try and save face, and it's a very easy habit to slip into, and then it kind of adds to the challenges for an adult, because I think, why do I lie so much to my partner about simple things? And so we develop all these ways of protecting ourselves, I suppose, from early on, and some of those will be maladaptive, not helpful. They create other problems. But a lot will actually also be very helpful, and they can be the good compensatory strategies that people use and are very clever with.
Okay. And so if a parent is listening and their child doesn't have a diagnosis of ADHD, but someone might have mentioned it or they've read something, what are the common presentations or the common signs, symptoms? What are parents looking for? What would they notice in their tweens or teens, and know that it's not just, their child is a bit fatigued or they have perhaps had a bit too much screen time? What are we looking for?
Yeah, this is a great question, because it's not about pulling out the DSM criteria and running down the list at all. So I'd describe some of those, the cognitive areas, the functional areas that are impacted in the brains, and parents might be able to get a bit of a sense of that. Something that I find always is helpful is to be thinking about whether your child makes sense to you. Does it make sense what they're good at and not so good at? Is it consistent, or are you sometimes left grappling of why can't they do that? They're smart? Why? Where was their common sense? What on earth were they thinking? If there's a pattern of that sort of thing and has been for a very long time, that's where you might start looking a little bit deeper. So it might be that the child's smart, but they don't seem to apply themselves, even though they want to do well at school. They might seem really capable, but only when it's for things that are interesting to them. And then for things that aren't interesting to them, they suddenly seem completely hopeless and can't do anything. You've modelled great values to them. Your child shows great values at some times, and other times they seem unkind or inconsiderate, and you're wondering where it comes from. These can be good indicators. Overall, if your child's running really low on self-esteem, they seem to be quite down on themselves, they give up easily, they're overly reactive, really sensitive to criticism, those can also be some of the telltale signs that you might need to look deeper about what's going on.
And things often come up at school, don't they, where the teachers will be saying, your child just doesn't seem to be on task, or they seem to be leaving things at home all the time, or they're not handing in assignments no matter how many times we've reminded them, or they're not even using their diary, or they're getting in trouble a lot. I think there's a lot of school-based feedback that parents might notice, and you're starting to see a pattern.
Absolutely, and the feedback from school is so valuable because that's coming from teachers that are seeing their peers at the same age, so it's standing out to them more. It's hard for a parent. You don't necessarily know what other kids the same age are going to be doing and not doing. But yeah, that feedback's really useful. However, if you don't have that feedback, that doesn't mean that it's not there.
Yes.
This is particularly the case with girls, where they'll go under the radar, and particularly the case with more intelligent students. So they might be getting a C average. They seem to be kicking along okay, and the teacher, might make a few comments about, they'd do a bit better if they, applied themselves a bit more. Perhaps they really should be getting A pluses on everything. Their IQ is there. But the difference between the A+ and the C is their ADHD symptomology.
Yeah. And we see some of those, particularly with girls. We see words used like they seem a little bit dreamy or a bit spacey. They're kind of off with the fairies. Those are just terms I've heard teachers use over the years. And, they're kind of not sure what's going on because the child seems to have the capability, but they seem to be off elsewhere. So yeah, I suppose there's lots of factors, and not every child with ADHD looks like another child or the other children with ADHD. It's so varied between children.
Absolutely.
And so when a parent is thinking, well, I want to explore whether this is a possible diagnosis that I'm heading towards with my child, what do they do? What are the steps that you recommend for parents?
Getting on wait lists as soon as you can. Don't wait until you're completely sure that, yes, we need an ADHD assessment. As soon as you have an inkling, I'd be getting along to the GP, getting the referrals you need to a paediatrician or to a child and adolescent psychiatrist or to a psychologist in the ADHD space, and just getting on the wait list, because the wait lists are long, and it might be that during that time you've discovered, no, we've worked it out, it's something else. But more often than not, I hear parents kicking themselves that they didn't add themselves to the wait list 12 months before. Jump on the wait list, and in the meantime, collect up as much information as you can from other sources. Make sure you've got copies of all school reports, particularly the earlier ones, as in the earlier grades, as much as you can. And every time you perhaps have a teacher mention to you about something that's not going so well for your child, or perhaps their basketball coach mentions something, or another parent, just keep a little log and note it all down, because that information can be really useful when we're doing assessments. You'll be glad you had it.
Okay, thank you. And so for parents listening who has a teenager who has a diagnosis with ADHD in high school, what do our teens need from us practically? So as parents, and then also I have teachers that listen to this podcast as well, what can they do to support students with ADHD at school?
Yes, okay. This is a loaded question. We could talk for hours and hours and hours. I suppose where people go wrong is they assume that intervention and support for ADHD involves changing the child. And when I say child, I mean adolescent as well, or the student. Whereas it's actually about changing the environment around them. And there's limited autonomy for an adolescent to do that at school, for any child to do that at school. The autonomy might be limited at home. It's actually the parent or carer at home that needs to be adjusting the environment around their child. To be able to know what environmental adjustments are needed, you need to be able to understand your child's ADHD, their profile. You need to be able to recognise certain symptoms playing out in front of you, the standout things that are creating the most difficulty in that moment. And then when you understand the problem, then you can come in with the right solutions. And the solutions, by and large, it's doing things for the child, adjusting the environment. But in the teen years, we really want to be focusing on our modelling and our coaching and starting to work collaboratively with the teen and allowing them an increasing role in that responsibility, and with the end game being as a later adolescent and heading into adulthood, they're starting to get a fair bit of independence with doing all of this for themselves. So to have the knowledge to do that, it's parent training and teacher training.
Yeah. And it's tricky because I'm thinking I might have someone hearing this or listening saying, well, that's just pandering to your child. But it's actually about compassion and trying to see something from your child's perspective. And I think that's where I keep coming back to how I cannot stand the end of the term ADHD as disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's nothing disordered about them. When I hear that word disordered, it assumes the opposite of order. So everybody else is ordered and somehow you are disordered. And so I love how you framed that. It's not trying to change the child or change the person. It's about adapting the environment and helping them to thrive the best way that they can with the gifts and abilities and the difficulties that they have, but within that environment. So talk to me a little bit about this parent training idea.
Yes, well, look, I'm so with everything you just said there. It's the square peg, round hole analogy, and yes, the phrase disorder, it's terribly ableist. It's an awful starting point to be even talking about any of this. So with my parent training that I do, I always start off restating ADHD as a self-regulation difference. And we talk about self-regulation, all those cognitive functions I talked about earlier. And one of the first slides is a picture of a square peg being jammed into a round hole with all the little chips of wood flying off the peg as they're being jammed through. And we talk about shifting their focus away from the idea that they're going to shape their child somehow to be normal, neurotypical, and instead we're going to work on changing the shape of that hole in as many areas of our child's life as possible.
In my experience with my own family and those I work with, I think it's so important that we find ways to adapt our parenting with our children with ADHD. Our ADHD teens will need different supports or strategies, different expectations in some areas, and they may even need a bit of a change in their environment. I've found that good morning and evening routines are helpful. Also, structure around study timetables, good bedtimes, and incorporating lots of healthy exercise are important. What I also find is that this will need to be revised regularly, and parents will usually have to be the ones who are setting reminders or alarms. It might feel frustrating that as a parent, you have to keep reminding your teen to check the routine or the list. But the nature of ADHD will be that they forget to check that list. It's a case of understanding this and then being there to support them without doing everything for them.
To keep their self-esteem intact, their self-efficacy, their belief in what they can do, and to allow them to use their strengths. because ADHD is not all deficit. It completely depends on the environment. And there's some amazing strengths in people with ADHD, and very excited about one study in particular that was talked about at the ADHD Professional Association conference earlier this year, where they're actually starting to gather the evidence to show there are strengths, there are things that people with ADHD do better than people without ADHD. And I think we're going to get a lot more research like that. But yeah, so the parent training, very much neurodiversity affirming. It is strengths focused. It is recognising that there's a social model of disability to play here, to realise that the disability aspect comes about through the interaction with the environment, the structures and expectations of society. It's not necessarily just not inherent in the person with ADHD. But it's also trauma informed. It's also understanding that there is that detection of threat. So often for people with ADHD, where they're receiving negative, punitive consequences for things that they can't control, and either the negative consequence comes from someone else, a punitive response, or even just a scowl on their face, or it starts becoming internally driven, where the person's beating themselves up and saying horrible things to themselves and willing themselves to try harder and be better. And we see that happening from a really, really early age. It's not uncommon at all at the practice here to hear of 7-year-olds asking, why are they a bad person? And they wish they could die so they could start again and be born a good person. Sort of, horrendous things that a parent never wants to hear come out of their child's mouth. But really, really early on, they start to have this, conceptualization of themselves that doesn't head down a good path. So in the parent training, we're really trying to reset that trajectory. We're getting the parent making the square holes, patching their little square peg back together as much as they can when they do have to face those round holes, that particularly at school. Really being their champion and there to catch them and build them up. Just white knuckle it through school. We'll do it together. Come out the other side, and then you can live your best life, and I'm there with you all the way. So it's a long game, and in the parent training, where I suppose it's a bit of a train the trainer, coaching the parent to become the coach for their child to get to that point.
And I think it really drives compassion. As you talk, I really hope that a lot of my listeners begin to see things from a different perspective and actually have some compassion, particularly when you talk about driving these poor little square pegs into round holes. It's not that we're pretending that there aren't some things that our children or adults with ADHD don't need to adapt to because they live in the world they live in. And of course, we work with them on some of those skills in the workplace or whatever it might be. But absolutely, I think there's places in society where we need to adapt because not everybody's neurotypical. And I think schools still have a fair way to go. There's some incredible teachers and beautiful principals who really do have that compassion and they do adapt. But I still think education systems as a whole have a long way to go to be incorporating all children's needs, not just your neurotypical children's needs who kind of sit quietly and do everything as they're told. So I love your compassion model and the coaching idea behind that. For some of our teens right at the end of their schooling, the last few years of school, they're about to leave school and enter work or uni or a technical course. What happens for them? I see that as quite a tricky year towards the end of schooling and the start of the year after school. What do you advise?
Yeah, it is a tricky time. There's a rule of thumb that gets around for supporting children, adolescents with ADHD, and it's take a third off their age and then pitch your expectations there. That is in relation to self-regulation, to those functions. So yes, their ability as a 12-year-old, their ability to control their attention and keep it on the important thing at that point in time, it might be more on par with an 8-year-old than their 12-year-old compared to their 12-year-old peers. But the thing is, that's just around self-regulation. And so a mistake I often see parents make is to not be taking that third off their age, of their child's age, for the self-regulation and having the same expectations on their child to do all the same things that, say, for example, an 18-year-old should be doing in their eyes. But where they will treat them younger is in these other rites of passage areas of life, getting their license, being able to go to parties, being able to have a partner stay over, being able to go on camping trips with friends. And they believe they're protecting their child because they see them do, silly, risky things seemingly, and feel they need to protect their child. But really, it doesn't pan out well. we need to be able to let our child keep up with their peers in doing all that awesome, fun stuff that you start doing around that time of life, but be there to support them in their self-regulation. And that might mean that, yes, you are willing to receive a phone call at 3 a.m. and pick them up because they've got alcohol poisoning, or they've, patch them back together after they've done something terrible and have been suspended from school and are distraught and needing to be there for them and, I suppose, support them through that emotional response they have at that time and that disappointment they have, and really, I suppose, acting as a safety net, like being there to catch them when they fall and they make the mistakes, but setting up things to make sure the consequences aren't too problematic. And this is with, the everyday stuff. Of course, with something very, very serious, we don't want them ruining their lives on a mistake. But yeah, so getting that balance right, understanding the difference between self-regulation and the extra support, and not becoming overbearing helicopter parent with everything.
And I think I'm so glad you've brought this up, because so often what our teens or our older teens need is that for us to be their cheerleader. But I also like how you say we can sometimes be their safety net. And sometimes, as a parent, it's terrifying thinking that your child with ADHD is going to potentially go out there and be impulsive and make some kind of decision. But so often that is the time they actually learn something. They learn by being around their peers, or they learn from a mistake. It's not by us telling them all the time what they should be learning. It's the real life experiences. And some of our teens young adults leaving school, they learn a lot more about themselves and learn new skills as they're out there and making some of those mistakes. And we're still there to help them and support them, so that we can just be there to be a sounding board for them and be there to listen and guide them if they need our advice after school.
Yes, and I think there's another component to it as well from the strengths angle, and that people with ADHD, they do have these strengths, and to be able to really use those and learn how to use those strengths, they might need to throw themselves into something that might seem risky and not a safe, sure bet, career-wise or lifestyle-wise, but they might need to just be able to do that, to learn how to use their specific strengths that might be a very small percentage of the population have. And if we don't allow them to do that, then we're really preventing them from being able to reach their potential. Then we're quashing them.
Yes.
I remember just from my own experience, I used to always say to my dad, stop quashing me, stop quashing me. I picked up the word somewhere. But that was without knowing I had ADHD, but just having this sense of, I had all these big ideas of things I wanted to do. And my dad sensibly would say, well, not many people make a living from that, and think of all the things that could go wrong. And why don't you just, get a job or go to university? And whereas I look back now and I think, no, I could have pursued some of those things and done all right.
Yeah.
So I think that's having a bit of faith that if you're a sort of neurotypical brain yourself as a parent, or even with ADHD, but not quite the same profile as your child, you can't make assumptions about the limits of what they're capable of, because they've got different resources to work with and they might be capable of an awful lot more. So then the job of being there to help them sort of go trial and error and analyse, okay, what worked then, what didn't work, how can I help you with this other part that's tricky there? That would be a really great approach to be taking at that time, I think.
Beautiful. And so finally, Maddi, what is your hope for young people with a diagnosis of ADHD?
Oh, gosh. My hope So many of my hopes and dreams in this space have been coming to fruition this year with the release of the clinical guidelines, which was part of the development group, and that was just great experience as a parent in this space to see so many professionals really dedicated to helping the ADHD community. So I guess for now, I just really hope that the current push on raising awareness and trying to address the gaps in the knowledge that our health professionals have, I just hope that continues at the same pace or an even bigger pace, because we've still got a long way to go, and particularly with getting schools on board and hoping, because I'm from a family of teachers and my husband's a teacher, I hope just, yes, knowledge, but also some more resourcing for schools to do this well and to ease the pressure on teachers. Yeah, so I hope all of that happens, but I'm also hopeful because I think there's some changes in society that are ADHD friendly. The gig economy is perfect. ADHD is not going to want to sign up for a permanent job for 40 years and retire and receive their gold watch. The gig economy is going to really suit the ADHD brain, and the opportunities to be self-made now with the internet and to use those entrepreneur skills that are really a big strength for people with ADHD. So society is becoming a better fit for the ADHD brain in that sense. And I think just overall the neurodiversity movement at large, whether it's ADHD, ASD, and all the other little quirks, the wonderful quirks that make humankind so interesting, that push for acceptance and value is gathering pace. It's an exciting time.
Many parents find themselves getting frustrated, asking, why is my teen still doing this? They should have learned these skills by now. Even though we know that the ADHD brain may have the self-regulation skills of someone who is younger, this does not mean that they are immature or childish. It's important to allow them to be a teen, but understand that they may need assistance rather than being treated like a child. If you're interested in finding parent, carer, or professional training, please have a look at Dr. Derrick's website to see what's available in your area, or use the contact form to register your interest. You can also find me or leave a question for a future episode via email or my Facebook page, or via raisingteens.au. Or you can go to the Hope 1032 podcast page. Please subscribe and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love to see you next episode, and in the meantime, keep parenting with your teen's future adult in mind.
This episode was hosted by Collett Smart, edited and produced by Alec Green, imaging by Lucy Weil, and social media by Beth Rivers.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.